All right, let's jump right into this explainer because today we are going to fundamentally shift how we look at business success. We've always been sold this very specific story about economic power, that it all comes from relentless hustle, sheer willpower, and grinding it out. But today, we're challenging that entire premise. We're going to see how economic power actually acts like a force of nature, and how the absolute most successful entrepreneurs don't create the flow of money. Nope, they just know exactly how to read the river.
So, to really wrap our heads around modern markets, we have to look back to an island in the Nile, just south of Cairo. Imagine an ancient stone staircase descending into the water. It's called a Nilometer. It might look pretty basic, but it did something absolutely astonishing. It translated the wild, unpredictable Nile River into a concrete number. The priests who maintained this, well, they couldn't control the rain, obviously, but they held immense power simply because they stood at the exact place where the future first became visible.
You see, their power wasn't in manipulation. It was purely in measurement. A reading of exactly 16 cubits, boom, a blessing. The flood would renew the soil, farmers could plant their crops, and the state collected its taxes. But if that number hit 14, we're talking famine. If it hit 18, catastrophic flooding. So the very earliest form of economic power was just reading the measurement before the rest of the world actually felt the consequences.
Now, compare that ancient wisdom to our modern business mythology. Our culture is completely obsessed with this idea of the heroic founder. We absolutely love the narrative that a visionary in a turtleneck magically summons demand out of thin air and bends reality to their will. And hey, it's a super flattering story for the winners, but it's wildly incomplete. The reality is far more meteorological. Cash moves through the economy exactly the way water moves through a watershed, following forces that were firmly in place long before that entrepreneur ever even showed up.
To actually read this economic river, you've got to understand the three unyielding forces that dictate the whole system: climate, geography, and rain. And these aren't just, background decorations. They are the fundamental, non-negotiable conditions that determine if a business is going to thrive or starve. Let's break them down.
First up, climate. This represents your broad environmental conditions. Think interest rates, technological maturity, consumer trust. Think about the dot-com graveyard of the late 90s. It's literally filled with brilliant founders who were intellectually right, but meteorologically wrong. They totally foresaw online commerce, but the climate just couldn't sustain their river yet. Broadband was too thin, online payments were primitive. In a wet climate, even mediocre ideas can flourish. But in a dry climate, a perfect idea will just die of thirst.
Then, we have the underlying terrain, or geography. Entrepreneurs don't just parachute onto a perfectly flat, empty plain. They arrive in a landscape carved super deep by decades of history, infrastructure, and regulations. Geography dictates the market's shape. It explains exactly why money rushes into certain channels and bypasses others entirely. It's why software swallowed some industries overnight, while others are still trapped in this deep institutional inertia. You really have to know the slope of the land before you set sail.
And the third force is rain. Rain is raw human desire. It's our endless, restless need to save time, gain status, make a buck, or just avoid embarrassment. And honestly, here is the most humbling realization for any builder. No entrepreneur actually creates wanting. You cannot invent the human desire to connect or transact. Sure, businesses can capture these flows, they can shape them, sure, but they do not create the rain. They simply catch what falls.
So, if you aren't making it rain, your entire strategy completely depends on where you stand in the river. The absolute best possible place to build? A confluence. This is the junction where separate tributaries meet and the flow just suddenly multiplies. Jeff Bezos built Amazon at the exact confluence of household computing, internet adoption, and credit card usage. A decade later, Stripe built a bridge right where the fresh current of modern software violently slammed into the legacy machinery of old banking.
Now, if a confluence is about multiplied flow, the narrows are all about constrained flow. And this is Google's entire playbook. Google didn't build the internet, and they certainly didn't invent human curiosity. But they built the ultimate sluice gate. They positioned their search box at the exact choke point where human attention literally has to pass to get information. When you govern the passage, you control the economics, which is incredibly profitable, but also exactly why they are constantly battling regulators.
Then we have the bend. Whenever a roaring river hits a curve, it loses velocity and quietly drops whatever heavy gold and minerals it was carrying. Some of the most highly successful, deeply unglamorous businesses live right here. Think about niche compliance software, boring B2B tools, specialist logistics.
The founders here aren't out to disrupt the future. They're patient readers of friction, quietly sweeping up all the wealth that the messy system sheds at the edges.
On the flip side, take a look at the delta. Wide, diffuse, and incredibly frustrating. The current fans out into countless tiny stagnant channels. This is the land of generic consulting, crowded local services, undifferentiated retail. It's a harsh truth, but most business failure is actually location failure, not execution failure. You'll see brilliant people rowing furiously in the flat waters of a delta, optimizing their websites to death, wondering why their massive effort never compounds. They just launched in the wrong stretch of the river.
But what happens when the water moves too fast? Well, that creates either rapids or waterfalls. Rapids are continuous turbulence. Think early fintech, or the absolute frenzy of the current AI gold rush. You cover massive ground really quickly, but the risk of capsizing is constant. A waterfall, however, is discontinuous. It's a terrifying ledge where the river stops being a faster version of itself and becomes something else entirely. The internet was a waterfall for media. The smartphone was a waterfall for human behavior.
Recognizing whether you're just in a rapid or approaching a waterfall is literally existential. Netflix succeeded because they read the geological survey of Broadband. They saw the ledge coming. Blockbuster, Kodak, print media, they didn't hail from a lack of work ethic. They encountered a massive waterfall and treated it like a rough patch of ordinary river. As our source notes so perfectly, they tried to improve the boat when the fundamental problem was the drop. Just a brilliant way to frame it.
Of course, wherever there is powerful water, humans are going to build dams. In our economic watershed, dams are the banks, the venture capital funds, private equity firms. Civilization absolutely relies on these structures to smooth out extremes, store surplus, and release capital. But they get really dangerous when the sluice gates create opacity. If a founder can't tell whether a drought is caused by weak consumer demand or just a closed investor gate, they aren't reading the water anymore. They're just guessing blindly in the fog.
This ecological lens also perfectly explains platform monopolies. In nature, competitive exclusion happens when one species colonizes the best riverbank and crowds out literally everything else. Tech giants do the exact same thing. They don't own the water, but they fence off the absolute best access to it. Viewed impartially, this isn't really a moral failing, it's an ecological reality. Monocultures are highly efficient for short-term yield, but they are deeply brittle when the environment inevitably changes.
Now you might be wondering, what about the crazy visionaries who literally blow up the terrain? The landscape architects, like Elon Musk with electric vehicles. Don't they defy this rule? Actually, scratch that. They prove it. Audacious engineering only succeeds if it follows an intense, almost obsessive observation of the existing flow. Tesla could challenge Detroit precisely because they deeply read battery curves and regulatory pressure before they ever started digging a new canal.
So, tying this all together, the crucial point is this. True strategy isn't about imposing your ego onto reality. It's a disciplined reading of reality before you take action. You have to ask the hard questions. What climate is changing? Where is friction building up? Where are two systems violently colliding? Rivers literally don't care about your passion or your pitch deck. You must observe where gravity and terrain are already compelling the water to move.
For you sitting there right now as a builder or a strategist, the takeaway is incredibly practical. The greatest fortunes in history are rarely built by magically conjuring water out of thin air. They are built by recognizing exactly where the landscape has already decided the river is going to run. You have to look at your current projects and ask yourself honestly, are you positioning your effort at a confluence where currents multiply, or are you just digging yourself into exhaustion in a stagnant delta?
As you plot your own course forward, remember those ancient priests on the Nile. The river was never theirs to command, and the market is never yours to control. But if you adopt the humility of the Nilometer, discard the myth of the heroic founder, and simply ask this one provocative question early enough, where's the water coming from? Well, that current just might carry you exactly where you need to go.